and welcome to Our People, the podcast where we give space for Holdeman stories. We focus on hope, healing, and inspiration. Connection, consciousness, and love are the driving motivations for this project. Remember to have grace for those who have chosen to speak out and share their experience. Please enjoy the story you will hear today.
Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. I'm your host, Caleb, and I'm here again with Dennis Goossen to talk about some Holdeman history, to discuss the 1970s. So welcome back, Dennis.
Thank you. Good to be back. Okay. Well, yes. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast. I've been working on this project for quite some time now because there's a lot of material to go through. We're going to be diving into a fairly dramatic chapter of Holdeman Mennonite history, the so-called quote-unquote purge of the 1970s. In the 1970s, the Church of God in Christ Mennonite began a sweeping campaign of member interviews and discipline. This was called panel work or paneling, and it meant that teams of ministers questioned every member of every congregation. It was an intensive, all-encompassing work, unprecedented in the Holdeman Church, and quite dramatic in its effects and in its aftermath. It was an intense effort, for many people traumatic, and a traumatic effort, as indicated by the term purge. Highly personal interrogations, and just the exceptionally large amount of people that were excommunicated during this period. I'm going to explore why church leaders felt like this was needed, why such drastic measures were needed, what actually happened during these interviews, and how the aftermath has reverberated through the Holdeman Church and current members and former members in the years that followed. I'm going to try to keep things grounded in real stories. I'm going to try to avoid speculation and rumors and hearsay as much as possible. I was fortunate to be able to interview real live people that lived through the purge, including current members, former members, current ministers, and former ministers. So quite a broad scope of people. I've also been able to dig through some official church records from that era, so we can compare personal experiences with official statements and official church publications, so we can understand what happened, why it happened, what lessons were left behind. So I'll start by setting the stage, and then I'll give Caleb a chance to break in with some questions. But yeah, why does a peaceful, nonviolent Mennonite church, known for being the quiet of the land, generally known for, Mennonites, Anabaptists are generally known for being very peaceable, very like mediator type of people, quiet, nice. Why did such a church undertake something that it seems quite extreme? So let's set the stage here. First of all, 1960s and 1970s in North America was a cultural hotbed of change at large, not just within the Mennonite world or within the religious world at all, but just at large. The 60s and 70s were seeing rapid cultural shifts. There was a counterculture movement. There was the sexual revolution. There was, anti-authority protests, media. New forms of media were taking off, music trends, and the conservative Mennonites were not immune to these influences. The church was seeing an increased amount of younger members working in towns, attending public high schools. Well, they'd always attended public high schools, but the influence from the schools was accelerating, and people were being exposed to new ideas. They weren't, secluded in their little agricultural agrarian communities anymore. They were beginning to integrate with the surrounding world. As a result, members began to question the teachings of the church, not necessarily in a challenging way, but just because they're being exposed to new ideas, new thoughts, people asking questions, and so they began to question as well. Now, because this is a church that values unity and purity above pretty much all else, this questioning is deeply, deeply unsettling for the Holdeman Church. So theological tensions within the Holdeman Church. The Holdeman Church teaches that it is the one and only true visible church of God. All other churches are formed to the displeasure of God. By the early 1970s, members, including ministers, were questioning this doctrine. They were questioning whether we were overemphasizing our exclusiveness. Are we excluding other Christians? Are we causing division with other Christians? Members, were beginning to interact with other people from other faiths, and realizing that these people had a connection with Jesus as well. These people were, they lived good moral lives as well, and so why are we dividing from them? Another question that began to arise was, what about salvation by faith alone, sola fide? Is that really true, or is that, or are we saved by our membership in a church, or are we saved by our obedience to rules? So these questions began to arise, and I know I interviewed Hank Weeb from Enderby, British Columbia, on this, and he said he noticed a doctrinal shift during the 1970s, where a shift went from a simple faith in Christ to a teaching and emphasizing loyalty to the institution and loyalty to ministerial authority as a means or evidence of salvation. And he was definitely troubled by this idea that you would need to bow to the church instead of trusting in Christ, or in addition to trusting in Christ. So people were beginning to fear, some of these members that were questioning were beginning to fear that the church was drifting from biblical foundations. This in turn triggered concern among church leadership. So leaders perceived this as worldly influences creeping into the church. They indicated signs of spiritual drifting, including youth were questioning church standards on modesty in dress, entertainment, church authority. If you refer to the Ministers and Deacons Council in 1972, you see a lot of discussion about radios, listening to music, long hair, men growing long hair, photography. These were things of the world that were coming into the church and was concerning to the leaders. In fact, the 1972 ministers meeting I'm referring to seemed to be a seminal meeting because there's various comments that I'm reading in the minutes that really jumped out at me. Terminology like a prevailing spirit of deception. Minister Milford Wanger says there's this independent spirit of me and God, in quotes, me and God, he's meaning that he's concerned that people are saying it's just between me and God, and instead of what about my church, what about my fellow church members and so forth, am I ignoring their authority or the influence in my life? Another minister, he's just bluntly saying, he's mentioning a group, and he's saying every doctrine of this church is contested in this group. By this group, he's meaning these questioning church members at large. There was no organized group at that point. However, did seem as if there was a division between leadership. Some leaders wanted to really enforce stricter discipline. Others were saying, patience and grace and take our time. And then ordinary church members were caught in the middle, unsure of which side to follow. And there was this growing gap in how do we address this? Or is this a concern to be addressed? And then if it is, how should we address it? And we began to divide into, for lack of a better word, conservative and liberal leaders, where you had the conservative leaders were really pushing for this firm discipline to restore the church purity, where we had, the more liberal or the more, grace and freedom type ministers that were wanting to, just go back to just simply preaching the Bible, preaching grace and forgiveness. One of the leading conservative ministers, Minister Joe Isaac, from Crooked Creek, Alberta, he's warning against a spirit of contention that sees the church as either too strict or too liberal. In other words, this spirit of contention is the problem with the spirit of contention is it's seeing a fault with the church. Some members are seeing the church was too strict, and on the other hand, some members were seeing the church as being too liberal. And the final conclusion of the 1972 ministers meeting was this concern that if action wasn't taken, the church would slide into lukewarmness. And ultimately, this is the meeting that seemed to have authorized the purge. So the Ministers and Deacons Council, there's a couple more things on 1972 here. They passed a resolution to deal with what they called, quote unquote, the present anti-element, which seems to mean this anti-element means an against element. So there's something that's against the church. And so they're passing a resolution to deal with this anti-element. They declared it unscriptural. They declared it a strange spirit that needs to be removed. And they indicated that revival meetings should take place, or the revival meetings should correct these members. And if the revival meetings failed to correct these questioning members, that then additional action would be taken. The term they used was necessary additional help that would work to save and cleanse the church. What this meant in black and white was that other outside ministers would come and visit congregations and enforce discipline. So this is the first layout of a blueprint for the purge, where panels of ministers began to visit churches, they began to question the members, and then purge the disobedient members. So that's the stage. That gives us the context, that gives us the motivations behind the purge. The next thing to get into is, what actually does happen when the committees came calling. How did it unfold, and what were its consequences? I'll pause there, Caleb, if you've got some questions or comments.
I don't think so. I think that's an interesting choice of words. The anti-element, kind of pretty vague, but
yeah, it's vague and it's awkward terminology, and some of it might be explained by the fact that the older leading ministers, English was not their first language, and they were working in English. So there is some of that, and then of course, being relatively rural and poorly educated, the grammar is not necessarily always their strong suit. But the meaning behind it is clear. They are looking at an anti-element, an anti-movement, a movement that is against, and that is their main concern, is that there's somebody that's moving against them.
Yeah, okay. I don't think that's anything.
Yeah. We'll move into what actually happened. And it's a little vague as to where and when things really began, but in practical terms, it seems as if there was general agreement that the first panels were in Canada, and probably southern Manitoba. I'm not 100% sure on that. That might be something another historian could address, or someone that has more details. But a revival meeting, as is normal, most current or past members of the Holdeman Church will be aware of revival meetings. And a revival meeting was called, as is normal, every year in a congregation, and they called in 5 or 6 ministers from the surrounding congregations to come and help. They came and helped, and their method of helping was to set up a system where the ministers, the quote unquote panel of ministers, would interview every member of the church to assess their faithfulness and their loyalty. Every member had to sit for an interview with these visiting ministers. And just backing up, generally, the first people to be interviewed were the home ministers themselves. So they came, this panel would come in and they would first interview and prove the status of the local ministers and deacons to make sure that they were on board, that they were good, that there was no dissent or wavering or doctrinal issues with the local leadership, and then they would move on to the rest of the members. The one anonymous interviewee, a current church member, he recalled being the first one called in his congregation, and the intense pressure that he felt like he was under. It was really, really stressful for him. Questions were things like, tell us about your conversion experience. How were you converted? When was this? Do you feel like you're growing spiritually? Do you fully agree with church doctrines and standards? And then from those basic questions, the interview would then turn into an interrogation. And they would begin to deal with questions in the person's life. Are you listening to worldly music? Do you go to the bar? Do you drink alcohol? Different things like that. How's your marriage? Are you faithful to your wife? Various pretty intense questioning, and it was emotionally difficult for the people that were being interviewed. The thing that was going on was that people knew that if you answered wrongly, you would be dealt with. So every person that was interviewed received a proving in writing, and anecdotally, what I gather is that hardly anybody actually got a quote unquote clean writing, that they were good to go. But everybody sort of had something, or most people had something indicated that was wrong in their lives. But if it was bad enough, it would be, either you are asked to repent, and that's an official church act, you're asked to repent, or you're excommunicated for failing to, live up to church standards or not following God or whatever. A question about how many people were excommunicated popped up. CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation up in Canada, they actually did a documentary on this purge, or not a documentary, a news story, because, it was currently happening. And their estimates were 10%, that 10% of the members were excommunicated during the purge. However, anecdotally, this is just, hearsay, but one minister was suggested to have excommunicated 140 men in Manitoba alone. So in one province, 140 men, based on membership records in that during that time period, that would be about 25%. I think I calculated at 23% of the membership, of the male membership was excommunicated. So that's pretty significant. But I mean, if you cast that over the whole church, even if it was as 10%, you can see that basically every family is affected, whether it's directly or relatives or friends. But it was, many people were taken out of church membership. I had mentioned Hank Weeb earlier. He was kind enough to give me a pretty in-depth interview, and I really enjoyed that. They are ex-members, former members of the Holdeman Church. He and his wife Ellis. They were in Enderby, BC. He grew up in Abbotsford. Moved to Enderby, and I don't know where he's living now, but that's where they were when they were in the church. But he talks about a story in 1975 where two visiting ministers had dinner at their house, and they pressed him repeatedly, questioned him about. So there was a disciplinary case in the local nearby congregation of Abbotsford where Hank had grown up, and do you think the church was right? Do you think the church was right? Hank kind of knew where this was going, and so he hedged around the question a couple times, and they kept pressing him, and so finally he gave them his opinion. He said, well, he believed that local congregations should handle their own affairs, that other congregations or other outside leaders shouldn't come in and interfere. Well, that put him and Ellis, in his words, on a suspect list. And ultimately, on March 11 of 1976, he and his wife were formally excommunicated. In that meeting, the leading minister read Romans 16, verse 17 and 18, where it says, mark those that cause divisions and avoid them. So they were indicating that Hank Weeb was causing divisions. And Minister Benny Hebert from the Linden, Alberta area, he got up as after Hank was excommunicated in that same meeting. He got up and he said, in quote unquote, this is a quote from him, "This man is very, very deceived. No one shall talk to him. So don't talk to him. Don't get anything from him. He's very, very deceived." And so when Hank had got home, I think his wife had stayed home and brought the news to her. She fainted at the shock of that. That was so emotionally telling or emotionally taxing to be excommunicated. And we could do a whole podcast on the emotional, social, economical, spiritual repercussions of excommunication, because I think people from other churches that aren't so intensely insular, they don't understand, I think, sometimes how life-changing it is to be excommunicated. You're cut off from friends, family members, sometimes jobs, sometimes it's hugely impactful.
Yeah, I'm thinking.
Yeah, go on.
Which a lot of these things that are happening, they're already, in existence in the church. You already have revival meetings. I assume that was the same way before the panel, where you would have visiting ministers come in, and then most everyone is interviewed or talked to on some level. There is most everybody has to have a conversation with them. Mm-hmm. And so this panel is really just kind of a ramping up and intensifying what's already there.
Well, let me correct something there. So the revival meetings were going before that, but the concept of pretty much everybody getting a conversation, that began, and that's an after effect of the panel work. That was not a thing prior to the panel work.
Oh, okay.
So prior to that, there'd be a revival meeting, which would basically be a set of evangelical preaching and a celebratory communion at the end of it. Instead of this present day, that shifted during the 1970s, and that after the 1970s, it turned into a kind of a mini paneling during the revival times where, the ministers try to get into every home and talk to every member and make sure that everyone's, clear and good and ready for communion. And then you have communion as a way of, the communion now essentially is a way of indicating that we have all been cleared. We're all clear before God, and we can all commune with God now.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, so some of my notes say, so the broader impact on members, of course, some were excommunicated outright and shunned. Some, especially leaders, some leaders were demoted. There's plenty of instances of ministers that were taken out of the ministry and just became ordinary lay members. Others were forced into retirement, as maybe a half step, a gentler step from from excommunication or losing your ministry position or losing your ordination, but rather we'll just ask you to retire. And there just was this general sense of fear and anxiety. This anonymous member I interviewed before, his quote was, "People were fearful this was as the." So the first anonymous member I interviewed was from one of the last congregations in the United States to have the panel work. And so his quote was that people were fearful because they had heard of all these expulsions and excommunications happening elsewhere. But he also indicated that the general sense was a sense of exhaustion. Like, people were now tired of this. It was the emotional toll of the whole thing was starting to tell. I had another anonymous interview of a member from Manitoba who he indicated that he couldn't have a normal wedding. He got married during this time period and couldn't have a normal wedding because of the strict atmosphere. They weren't allowed to have, I think, a wedding reception possibly, or a choir. One of the things that they had wanted was not allowed. And also his father was expelled for a number of years during that time. And they were from a congregation that was kind of deemed one of the black sheep congregations. And so they were really ashamed to admit which congregation they were coming from for quite a few years after that. Families were divided. Shunning was actually a lot stricter back then than what people are used to now, including, some of it remains, but indications are that it was a lot harsher back then. So not eating together, limited contact, those things we might be used to, but businesses were shunned. So people were not allowed to go into the business or do business with people that were excommunicated. People that were excommunicated when they attended church were not, they were ignored. So nobody was allowed to, even greet them or say hello or chat with them or whatever. I know one of the members from Greeley, Colorado, we have an interview with, I refer to an extensive interview that's on YouTube with some members from Greeley. And they indicated about how they rarely saw some cousins anymore after they were excommunicated. They just weren't allowed contact with them anymore.
Just a thought
depression.
on that.
Yeah.
If you don't mind. With the shunning being more extreme, some of that would come from that environment of needing to appear pure yourself and make sure you're good and in the clear. And I don't want to associate with him because I don't want to risk the wrath of the system.
Yeah, exactly. And there's this terminology of spirits and deception that's going around. And so the fear is, if you're deceived and then I go and spend time with you, that spirit of deception can cross over from you to me, and now I'm also deceived because I've been listening to you and I've been sympathizing with you. So there's this aloofness and this kind of arm's length. You have to keep people at arm's length because of that.
Yeah.
So I mentioned this news story that the CBC put on, the CBC based out of Winnipeg, and they went into Steinbach, Manitoba, and interviewed a number of people there, quite a few people actually. And they reported on the emotional trauma, family separations, and even some suicide attempts. So you can see that actually there were people that, they attempted to take their lives because of how strenuous this experience was. I was going to I'll go through the Greeley, Colorado case now, and there is a extensive interview with some of the former members at Greeley, Colorado, who sat for an interview a while back. So that's on YouTube. I referenced that, and I spoke to them personally as well, to these members. But so the Greeley, Colorado case is kind of, it's reached almost mythical status in the Holdeman Church as this case of a congregation that went bad, and this dramatic thing. So Greeley, there was the Majestic View congregation in Colorado. It was led by Minister Gerald Miniger, who was from out of California, and so it was a new congregation, a new church plant in Greeley, Colorado, and they developed a reputation for they did things a little bit differently. One of the things that sort of jumped out right at the beginning is they had mixed seating. The men and the women sat together in church. Well, that was different from the rest of the Holdeman Church, and so that immediately put a black spot on them. They emphasized, or Gerald Miniger, the preacher there, had this strong emphasis on justification by faith and this minimal or minimized focus on church authority. So in 1976, things came to a head at Greeley where the outside panel finally came in, and they, up till 1976, the local Gerald Miniger and the local deacon and there was like a church board there. They would invite people to come, or ministers to come for revivals, and they would invite people that they knew had similar thinking, this focus on justification by faith, Bible alone, not a church authority emphasis. Well, in 1976, that was no longer allowed to happen. The local church problems committee assigned 2 ministers to go to Greeley for revival. This came to a head. Gerald Miniger was really distraught about this. He didn't know what to do about it, but it finally came to a head where he stopped the visiting minister mid-sermon. He finally, in the middle of a sermon, got up. He said, "You have to stop." And he says, "I can't agree with this anymore." And so he literally stopped him in the middle of a sermon, and the congregation went home. They filed out and went home, and it was just, they just couldn't do it anymore. The end result was that almost the whole congregation was excommunicated. And it couldn't happen at the congregation, because typically an excommunication happens because there's a vote in the congregation. So what happened is there was a panel of all the ministers and deacons in the area convened together and decided this instead. Not in the area. It was a church-wide, or USA and Canada-wide panel of ministers that made this decision. But they excommunicated all but 4 families in that in that congregation. The other 4 families, they all moved away to other congregations. That was finalized by 1978, and the congregation did not disappear or dissipate at all. They joined another Mennonite conference, and then merged with another Mennonite church in town, and it still exists today in another building. I think the building is now defunct, but the church is still there today, alive and well. But it's become this legendary cautionary tale of these rebels, these people that wouldn't listen, they wouldn't submit. In the immediate following years, there were some pretty wild rumors about Greeley, Colorado. Like, why were they all expelled? I know one member said, this before they were even excommunicated, and they were at this other wedding, and they said, "Well, we're from Greeley," and some lady, she says, I thought you guys were holding orgies out there." This just pretty wild rumor, about what's going on there. But in essence, they were just simply living a Christian life, but certainly more liberal than what the Mennonites were used to.
Yeah.
Any questions or thoughts? I'm about ready to move on to the next section here.
No, I don't think so. I'm just trying to remember. So this was before there's different districts. The church is divided into different districts, and then each district has its own problems committee. Is that the way it was?
Yes, that's the way that was. So this was one of the interesting evolutions of how the church dealt with things, and I'll tackle that some in the next section. But there were districts before that. I mean, during this time in the 1970s, there were districts. There was, Canada was its own district, and then there was Central, East, and West. I think were basically like 3 districts in the U.S. and 1 district in Canada. And each of them had a problems committee, a church problems committee. And these were the committees that were authorized to go and deal with problems. And so they dealt with this. And actually, by the end of the whole panel time, those problems committees were disbanded because of the issues that were happening. And a central, what is now the CCC, the Church Counseling Committee, was formed instead, which is formed of members from all of the different districts. So, yeah, that was a part of it. Okay, so yeah, anything else on that?
Well, we might be jumping ahead, but forming the CCC in a way was a way to like centralize the, you could have a problems committee in one district deal with something differently than they would elsewhere. And so the CCC is kind of a way to centralize that authority, if you will.
Right, that's correct. Yes, it was. Maybe even centralized might be the wrong word, because one of the issues was the central committee, the Central Peace Problems Committee, was trying to assert its authority over the other committees because it was the Kansas committee. And the other committees weren't appreciating that. And so the CCC was a way of, I don't know the terminology or what the right word is, but it was a way of unifying, might be the right word, unifying the approach so that it's one committee with members from all the different areas instead of each committee doing their own thing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, well, so by the late 1970s, this sort of, as you can see, it kind of took off in 1976, was sort of the first steps of the purge or the paneling work. By the late 1970s, we really had quite a fractured church. Membership growth had stalled. It still technically did grow almost all of these years, but it kind of came down to an almost zero growth in these years. Those that remained were pretty divided. Like some were saying this purge is actually saving the church, where others were thinking this is going too far, we're harming sincere believers. And so the church leadership had this turning point of, okay, what do we do? Does something need to change? Do we continue this? And how do we go forward? At a certain point, they realized that this was becoming unsustainable, and do we need to reconsider our approach? And so now we move into the aftermath. How did this end? Okay, so by 1979, we've divided into already what we said, the strict and the moderate factions. There's this widespread division, which is the very thing the purge was meant to prevent. So by 1979, in the 1979 annual meeting, they made a decision to pause all ordinations, freeze all major church work, all major church decisions and businesses, everything, with the exception that marriages and baptisms could continue. So they froze everything. They acknowledged that there was a spirit of division that had overtaken the church. And they formed a committee, an investigative committee, that they don't really have any official name. In later minutes, they're just simply referred to as the 11-man committee. The 11-man committee was formed in part, just to address the whole purge, or the whole paneling work. And I don't see this really addressed in my notes anywhere, but one of the things that really came to a head was at the Whitemouth, Manitoba congregation up in Manitoba, which they were a black dot congregation. They were too liberal, and So other congregations are basically shunning the people from the Whitemouth congregation because they were too liberal. So the panel from Canada came to Whitemouth, and they were going to clean house and take care of this whole situation. They began to be so strict with their approach and so brutal with their approach that some of the people at Whitemouth actually called for help from the other committees, the other problems committees, and they came. So specifically, the Central Committee came, and I think maybe one other committee. I'm not sure, but anyways, that turned into a real altercation at the Whitemouth Church, where Benny Hebert from the Canadian committee and then an Unruh from the American committee were basically nose to nose and saying, well, you stay out of my turf and I'll stay out of yours, kind of that sort of talk back and forth between them. And finally, everybody left. So, and that was that was shocking enough to everybody that they decided, okay, we have to do something. And so this 11-man committee was formed to do some findings, to interview people, talk about people. And their whole report is found in the 1981 annual meeting minutes. And the summary of that was that basically mistakes had been made on all sides. There was pride, there were missteps. The committees were overreaching. They were too loyal to themselves and not willing to listen to others. And the first major concession here, they actually admitted faults as to how discipline was handled. With a key caveat, they never admitted publicly. This was only in annual meeting minutes where this actually happened, which these minutes are not meant to be disseminated to the general public. They're kept secret. They're kept only for the leadership. But within the leadership, they admitted their faults. They also noticed, this is one of the repercussions, they noticed that people were coming to these committees and they were saying, basically, I can't be at peace with myself until you approve of me. They wouldn't say that in so many words, but basically they needed the approval of the ministers before they could be at peace with themselves. And some of them even so far as, I need to get excommunicated and then reaccepted so that I can be at peace with myself, because then I will know that my life is pure. Then I will know that I'm clear before the Lord. My conscience can be free. And there were enough ministers that noticed that this is a significant doctrinal problem, theological problem. If you are looking for approval from someone else to be at peace before God, that's an issue. That's a problem. So there was supposed to be a shift in emphasis here. There was supposed to be this, greater humility in the leadership. They're supposed to reaffirm justification by faith, not the approval of people. Although, really, the words were said. I don't know. It remains that's a separate discussion as to whether the practice actually changed or the theology actually changed. But the outcome was simply that the purge ended by 1981. It was done. There was no more panel work, sweeping, all comprehensive panel work by that time. And the official statement within the annual meeting minutes was that the church was hopeful that confession, forgiveness, and patience would restore fellowship. So the purge, or the panel, was ended, but that was not the end of the ministerial panels. This whole concept of the panel is a leftover from the panel work. So the practice of a group of ministers getting together to prove, quote unquote, prove a situation, that continued. That was a new innovation, at least for the Holdeman Church during that time, and that was continued. So even decades later now, individuals that are facing doctrinal concerns or discipline are summoned before a panel of ministers. Like you mentioned, Caleb, at a revival meeting, you get this conversation with, the 1, 2, 3 ministers at the very least, the 2 revival ministers plus 1 local minister or deacon, and you get interviewed, or at least this discussion. And then if it got serious enough, then you get called in for an interview, and it's all the ministers and deacons, and they will prove your life. I mean, that's like, I myself, in my journey, I faced groups of up to 7 ministers at a time, all by myself, being called in to prove my doctrinal stance on things. So it's obviously a very, yeah, it's obviously, that's a very intimidating experience. And I don't know that that's the stated intention. I think that the stated intention is that, well, you know, multiplicity of counselors, you know, put 7 heads together, that's better than one, and so we'll have 7 of us talk about you. The interesting thing is, and I commented this to those 7 ministers, is that they never really asked for my input when it came to proving my situation. But anyways, but yeah, that remained. Then there's this interesting phenomena that I've noticed, and different people that have done some of the therapy or just sociological studies. There's this survivor mentality that came over the Holdeman Church, which I think bears some study. The people that remained, the 90% or 75% of people that remained in the Holdeman Church, because during that purge time, most of the people that were excommunicated did not come back. That's another thing. Like nowadays, I don't know, probably more than 50% of the people that are excommunicated end up going back into the Holdeman Church. But back then it was, I mean, during that specific time, it was the majority of them did not end up coming back. So there's this us versus them identity. There's this, we are the faithful remnant. We are the ones that endured. We're the true loyalists. And there's this shared trauma of, we've all gone through this together, and we've proven our commitment to the Holdeman faith. I didn't even have time to put this into my notes, but just yesterday I was given a writing or a talk given by a former member, and he and his brother were both excommunicated in the 70s, and one of them ended up being a college professor of some type, and he said that in many senses, the Holdeman Church operated very much like a gang. Like there's this initiation ritual that you have to go through, and it's painful, and then maybe an annual thing that you have to go through, that it's painful, it's hard, and it's traumatic, but you survive. And so then you've got this survivor mentality. I did it, I got through it, I handled it, and so I'm one of the faithful, you know. And whereas the people that left were seen as fallen away. They're fallen away. We're the purified church. And in the end, the ones that remained really solidified this exclusivity doctrine. So the one true church thing really strengthened during the purge, because those that didn't have a strong stance on it didn't stick it out. They were gone. So yeah, you definitely see that. It really did strengthen the sense of church identity. Well, our time is running out. I've got some stories of people that have left life after excommunication. What I maybe do is I'll kind of hop, skip, and jump through some stuff, and maybe we can do like a Q&A session on a future podcast, and listeners can submit questions. That might be interesting.
Sure. One of the things I was curious about, and maybe you've got some stories or something with this, but there was also like changes in dress codes, changes in the kinds of vehicles you were allowed to drive, like rolling back some of those permissions when it came to technology and like material possessions. I wondered if you had any thoughts or comments on that.
Yeah, I asked about that with a number of people, and it was hard to pin down really. Some of the people, like I asked Hank Weeb about that, and I said, like, specifically, like, did people dress differently? The one thing that came out from a couple different interviews, that the women's skirts definitely got longer. So they went from knee length skirts to, like, mid calf length skirts. So dressing got a little bit more conservative. People got rid of their possessions and things like that. I think maybe none of the official decisions changed, but people were just a lot more careful afterwards. They were careful to be moderate and to be a little bit under low key with the things that they allowed themselves. You know, radios weren't allowed anymore, or radios weren't allowed previous to that either, but, you know, they were more faithful with getting those things out.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one of the biggest things was that Bible studies, and maybe like listening to reading books of theologians outside the Holdeman Church, and or listening to Bible studies or sermons or talks by outsiders. That one was a big one that they really cracked down on. I heard that a few different times. Yeah, so life after excommunication for the people that left, what happened to them? There was probably some immediate, there were immediate hardships. People that lost family, community, and support networks overnight and had to start over, start over with career, start over building their social networks and so forth. But there's this sense of relief and renewal. Like this is actually, interestingly enough, this comes from a current member. So this interviewee is currently a member in good standing. He did not get excommunicated during the panel work. And his comment about the people that were expelled was that most of them felt this sense of relief. They were relieved to be free of church control. Many of them joined other Mennonite churches. Some of them joined other non-Mennonite churches. Some of them continued as Christian families without a formal church home. And then there were those that left religion altogether. And there were a number of them, and a not insignificant number, that experienced significant mental and emotional difficulties. So I know I've talked to numerous current and past members that even today, when I ask them to remember the panel times, they will show signs of emotional distress just remembering that time. So it was definitely a difficult time. Yeah, all in all, we do see some types of reconciliation trying to take place. Like Hank Wiebe has mentioned, he's tried to talk to some of the previous leaders. Gerald Miniger, the minister from Greeley, he's passed away now, but he was able to talk to some of the ministers that were involved, and they expressed some, regret might even be too strong a word, but some misgivings, some questions about what happened back then in the 1970s. Ultimately, most of the people that left never returned. The church moved on, but with probably a little bit more cautious approach to discipline, but certainly a stronger church identity. And one of the biggest things that they've learned was, that when push comes to shove, this method does work. That's in their world, in their terms. This is now the modus operandi for the Holdeman Church, that when there is dissent, when there's division, when there are doctrinal questions or people that are questioning the doctrine, the process is we convene a panel, we interview the member, we prove the member, and then if necessary, we excommunicate the member. And whether it's, they've proved it already. If it's 10% of the membership, if it's 25% of the membership. I was part of a congregation in my journey where I think it was a third of the congregation was excommunicated finally because of our movement. So wow. It is in their world, in their worldview, a tried and true method, and this is how we survive, by cutting out anyone that dissents. And that's pretty much it. I wanted to. I thought maybe I could end on a more positive note, but yeah. Let's just say this is a challenging piece of church history. If one of our listeners, if you've experienced this time, or you've got family members definitely that experience this time, I want to honor everybody's experiences. I want people to reflect on what a healthy community really does and should look like. I want to remind people that just because your community has let you down, that doesn't mean that all community is bad. We humans do need community and faith in our lives. So, we want to learn from history. We want to learn from what happened, and we want to learn how to avoid the mistakes of the past and grow in the future.
Yeah, I'm thinking more about the traumatic events,
Mm-hmm.
or the trauma aspect of it. And obviously for the one who's interviewed and maybe goes through that, there's this essentially it's a loss of your own voice. It's a loss of your own self identity, and you really have to give that up if you're going to choose to stay in. But I would imagine there's also some trauma and some effects on the ones that are doing the interviews, are having to enforce this worldview. I don't know what that would be specifically, but I would imagine there's traumatic effects even for those that are asked to enforce the system, so to speak.
Yeah, I can talk about that just a little bit, because I've seen that. One thing that I've seen is some of the, maybe let's just say, kind of mental or emotional breakdown that has happened with some of these older ministers as they aged. Like, I don't want to speak ill of the dead. Minister Benny Hebert, I mentioned him before. He was one of the leaders. And in his older years, he really tried to undo some of the damage he had caused. And it taxed his mind. I was with him during some of that time period, just a member in the same congregation he was at. And I could see the mental trauma and turmoil that he was in as he, would think through the things that he did. And then, of course, he was still trying to be loyal to his church, and yet he would kind of battle with the actions of the past. And then in a more recent example, because I didn't live through the 1970s, so I can't speak to that, but I think of my own excommunication. And I was in a congregation with one minister, and he and I were close, very close, very good friends. He's significantly older than me, but I would see him as a surrogate father, grandfather kind of figure in my life, and we were very good friends. And I watched his emotional turmoil too. And, obviously his beliefs are sincerely held beliefs, And so he thought that he was doing this for the salvation of my soul and for the salvation of his congregation. And he was like, he told me this, he was under pressure from the outside body, other ministers that he was subject to, that he had to excommunicate me. This was what he had to do. So yeah, it was to put it bluntly, a misguided trauma, but trauma nonetheless.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful to remember when, maybe those that have been excommunicated are hurting. It is helpful to remember that there is hurt on the other side too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know. Does that pretty much wrap it up, or?
That's what I've got. I've got lots of material. I've got interviews. I've got all the official church records from that time period, or at least a lot of them. I've got the messengers of truth from that whole era, all of that stuff. So if people do have follow-up questions, they can reach out to us one way or another, and we can do that, or however we want to go forward.
All right. Well, sounds good.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening. It is an honor to connect with our guests, and we wish the best for them as well as our listeners. Remember to like and subscribe for more episodes. Our People can be found on all major podcast platforms as well as YouTube. If you are interested in sharing your story, please contact us at ourpeoplepodcastteam@gmail.com. Thank you.